Greetings, friends. My guest today is Mark Stavish. Stavish's credentials are too numerous to list in a reasonable time frame, but among the highlights are his status as Director of Studies for the Institute for Hermetic Studies and author with Inner Traditions. In the description box below this video, you can see a list of his works and resources and how to access them. I encourage seekers everywhere to do so in this quest towards understanding and self-betterment, and I believe that self-betterment is the true way towards this thing that we call enlightenment. I can think of no modern works that can better aid your journey. Stavish's 2018 book Egregores has made quite a splash in both esoteric study circles and the general populations, which is a relatively rare thing. That book is what compelled me to contact Stavish and ask him about what is admittedly a rather strange but I hope fascinating idea. Specifically, I was curious about how the Egregore concept might apply to the rather bizarre fact that the controversial yet indisputably influential book known as the Necronomicon was being constructed and released upon the world at the same exact time that the Son of Sam murders were happening in New York. This is in 1976-1977. For those who don't know, David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, had ties to a cult, as well as to the occult, that are widely documented, though they are generally underplayed in the mainstream narrative of the story. So I was curious about Mark's thoughts on the subject, but maybe more importantly, I was curious about what actionable and positive lessons could be learned from that event, and from the notion of demonic egregores in general. Stavish certainly didn't disappoint. He left me with a great deal to think about. He also inspired me to add a brief note for my fellow explorers of the strange and the dark. As I'm sure you agree, there is no entertainment better than delving into high strangeness in all its various manifestations, including things like dark occult mayhem. However, consider this a friendly reminder to not allow the dark pull of the rabbit hole to overshadow your life. Remember to look at the light as well, to focus on your health, your finances, your general happiness, and your contributions to your friends, family, and community. As far as I'm concerned, when we get lost in the rabbit hole of the dark side of things, the dark side wins. But, with that unasked for advice out of the way, let me assure you that in this video, Stavish does the vast majority of the talking. He shares his highly qualified insights into the Necronomicon and the Son of Sam cult. We definitely get some tasty nuggets of darkness. So, with that out of the way, I will shut up and let the man speak. While I am a devastatingly handsome and charming man, you're all here for Mark Stavish, not for me, so let's have at it. All right, Mark, thank you for taking the time to just talk today.
Well, great. Thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to be here.
How are things in Pennsylvania?
Well, they are wonderful, and we have a little bit of snow on the ground today.
Nice.
So it's really great.
That's cool. You're near Wilkes-Barre, right?
Yes, in fact, we are very close to Wilkes-Barre, probably about 2 miles. Takes about 15 minutes to get to there.
That was also Mitch Horowitz's stomping grounds, right? That's for Mitch.
Yeah, he. In fact, I've reminded him ever so politely that we were at the Times Leader at the same time together.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He does not remember me. I remember him. And
oh, that's cool. I was born and raised a little outside Scranton, so I know I've been gone from there for a while. But
where at?
Right. I grew up in a town called Newton, which is near Clark Summit.
I know Newton. Yeah, Clark Summit very well. Yeah. Clark Summit has its phases of becoming a kind of new agey town every now and then. It does. It's quite the place.
Yeah. I know exactly the store you're referring to, or like one of the stores you're referring to. It's right there in the corner of the main street. Yeah.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about kind of an odd subject, but hopefully that makes it interesting and fun and intriguing. Right. And so before getting into that, though, we're going to have to lay a little groundwork for those people who aren't familiar with the basic concept of egregores. And I also just wanted to make a little observation that I've noticed egregores seems to have been quite successful. I see all over the internet. There's people talking about it, interviews, discussions. It seems to even have had some appeal outside the circles that are normally interested in such maybe niche fringe ideas. It seems to me like possibly a reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is because we're living in this time where I feel like people instinctively, some consciously, are looking around and feeling like there is some kind of concerted machinations and plans in order. And yet it doesn't seem feasible or realistic to think that it's actually individual people, leaders of state, that are coordinating all of these things. Like, we kind of live in paranoid times. And I think that the egregore, the concept, maybe gives people a possible explanation for how that is happening, how there can be a unified movement in one direction without every individual like actually sitting there pulling puppet strings. But before, first, I want to know what you think of that observation. And then number two, if you could please just discuss briefly the idea of the egregore for people who have not encountered the book or the concept yet.
Well, the notion of egregores has really taken off. The book was an incredible success. And, it was really just going to be a small monograph privately published by the Institute. And, it came into being quite by accident. I was having lunch with Jocelyn Godwin, and I just mentioned to him in passing I was going to write this monograph. And he said, well, thank God, because if you don't, I'll have to. And I wrote it very quickly. It happened very easily. And Inner Traditions loved it and picked it up because it's very conversational in style. When we originally wrote it, it didn't really have chapter breaks. It was a conversation. I just went from topic to topic to topic. And we said, well, that's a good place for a chapter break. And that's a good place. And that's a good place. And that's what it is. So people like it because they can read it and understand it. It's like Baby Bear's porridge. It's the right size. It's not overwhelming. And I described it as that because I wanted to make it bigger. And I said, no, I'm just going to ruin it if I make it bigger. This is what people need, and they can figure out the rest on their own if they want to. So the book has taken off as a success. And the idea, people write to me, I just get an email usually once a week from someone saying that the book has changed their life because they finally understood what was going on, usually within a small group. They were in a church or a religious movement or a political movement, and they finally got it. Oh, that's what was happening. And I get it. And that's why they're able to extricate themselves from that situation more easily. So it has a strong therapeutic component to it as well. It's not simply a set of observations. But that said, the notion of the egregore, as you see it in popular discussion even within the last week, in terms of, I believe the phrase is mass psychosis formation.
Right.
And we'll get to that shortly. What needs to be understood about an egregore is that there's two notions of it. One is the classical notion, and one is the modern notion. The modern notion would fall into the mass psychosis formation and Jungian collective unconscious. The classical notion would extend further beyond the collective unconscious into the notion of metaphysical realities. That is, are there invisible or metaphysical components to this beyond the psychological? And I allow individuals to come to their own conclusions on that. You have to come to your own conclusions. No one can tell you for certain one way or the other. But they all have the same aspect in common. And that is what is the relationship of individuals to each other, particularly when they were in a group, and then how does that group affect the individuals within it, and what is this feedback loop, and how does that limit people? Because an egregore is essentially, as Jacques Vallée referred to UFO phenomena, a social control mechanism. Now, when we think of social control, we think of it in negative terms, but they can also be positive as well. And I give the example of when you go to the university and you want to be an engineer, there's only so many English literature courses you can take and still graduate on time as an engineer. So limits are the nature of our reality. The question with the egregore is, are those limits helpful to us and benefiting us? And if so, how do we know? And maybe they benefit us in the beginning, but at some point they no longer benefit us. Okay, they're not helping us. And how do we recognize that and get out of that relationship in a healthy and whole manner? So that is the nature of the egregore. Okay. I believe that it has taken on a tremendous amount of social increase over the last few years. I'm convinced of that. And it is because people are looking for answers, and the book gives a very solid explanation of classical and modern understanding of, again, the term that we hear used in the last few weeks is that kind of mass psychosis formation.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. That's a great, concise explanation. And so taking that concept specifically, the thing that we spoke briefly about on the phone and that initiated me to call you was, in the circles of people who still are trying to figure out the whole Son of Sam story. And for those people out there who aren't familiar, there are actually still a lot of mysteries to that story. It's not a kook subject, although there are kooks who get into it, but there is actually legitimate mysteries involved. And so in looking at this, it's just an interest of mine. I realized, and I'm not the first person to realize, that the Necronomicon, which in itself is a very controversial book, there are some people, including supposed Simon, who contend that it's an actual translation of an ancient Sumerian grimoire. And then there are other people who think it was invented in the 1970s. But either way, what we know as a fact is that while the book was being put together, whether that was being translated or being invented, it was happening in an occult gift shop in New York City as the Son of Sam murders were happening. They were happening at the same time. In addition to that, multiple people have said that the Son of Sam cult, the cult of which Berkowitz was a member of, frequented the Warlock gift shop, which was later called the Magical Child gift shop. I get confused in the chronology of the two stores. But basically, so all these things were happening at the same time. And this is at the same time that the 1970s New York was a very decadent, violent, indulgent period of time. And so there's various hypotheses that have come out of this. Some people thinking that there was some kind of concerted social engineering effort that was being manipulated out of there. That hypothesis is given a little more credibility by the fact that a guy named Peter Levenda is involved. I won't go into depth about that, but suffice it to say, Peter Levenda has proven intelligence ties, and a lot of people think his connection to it contributes to it. Another hypothesis is that the Necronomicon was just made as a grift, and it's just all coincidence. But there's actually a third idea, which is the thing that got me thinking about your book, Egregores, and that's what made me want to contact you, is more of the idea that out of that general madness of that time in that place, that basically a demonic Egregore came out, and that would explain how so much madness and chaos was happening at the same time. And so the questions I'm really interested to ask are your thoughts on the Necronomicon in general, and your thoughts on the possibility that everything that came out of that time, out of that place, was some kind of egregore phenomenon.
Well, we have to be careful about the term egregore. We don't want to overuse it, because an egregore is always a collective. And just because you are part of a collective doesn't necessarily mean you're part of a egregore per se. And I want to make a mild distinction with that. If you are unaware of the other components of the group, that is, there is a central figure or figures that are kind of playing around with everything, you're not necessarily part of what we would call a strong egregore. It's more of think of a store where people come and go. They're not necessarily part of an egregore there as customers. Depends on their emotional commitment to that store and what it represents to them, in terms of things. But that needs to be clear. Egregores are very specifically weak or strong, but you generally have a specific purpose that is known to the members, or not always, but generally speaking. But you do have those collective forces, those collective entities that people get sucked into, that's swept up into. And they are kind of egregore. So if we look at New York in the 70s, and we have to really understand that this is a really violent place. If you look at the images of the time, if you look at the newsreels, this is when we see a lot of the vigilante movies coming into the popular psyche. It was rough. Now, at the same time, we see by 1975, the counterculture movement had collapsed. Now, counterculture, when we think of it, is generally a West Coast phenomenon, but it did have its East Coast counterparts. Okay, and for the most part, that movement lasted from roughly 60, 65, 60 at the earliest, if you really want to push it to 75. You could maybe push it a few years further out, but it really by 75, it had collapsed. Many of the stores that were in existence were the focal point of activity. And the Warlock shop, which I remember going to as a child, and then, of course, Magical Child later on, these were among the focal points of activity because this is where you went to get stuff. And that needs to be understood. It's not as if, you could go to your local temple and get things. There weren't local temples. Temples often met in these stores. These were small groups. They often did not have property of their own. They didn't have their own facilities. They're meeting, as they often do today, in private houses, apartments, or spare rooms off someone's office or garage or what have you. So it really needs to be understood when we say they're all focusing in on the Magical Child. Well, yeah, it's because that's where you went in New York. There were other places to go, but that was the big one. We would go in, we would take the bus in to go to Philadelphia or New York to go to these places because the other one was Weiser's. Okay. So it needs to be thought of in that wider construct of what was available.
Right.
Of course, Magical Child was a wild and decadent place. And it has earned its place in the history of 20th century occultism for a lot of strange and peculiar things. And some of them probably good, some of them questionable, but it had to do with the nature of the movement at that time. Okay. So when we look at the cultural environment, the main focus of the Warlock shop or even Magical Child was Western magic, a lot of Crowley, a lot of witchcraft. And that is properly the word witchcraft, not Wicca. Okay. That was something that was still emergent and wouldn't pop up until the late 70s, early 80s as a term. The ideas were very much about personal power and authority in that regard. That's what the rituals are about. You did have other things as well, but it was very much focused on some kind of personal action, okay, and action rather than enlightenment. That needs to be very clear. There's a difference between the two. So you have this environment in which these things are happening. And from a metaphysical viewpoint, this is a ripe environment because like attracts like. If you have filthy streets, it's going to be difficult to have a lot of healthy people, healthy thoughts, healthy activities, right?
Right.
I mean, that was a joke about New York. The rats were running the streets and how big they were and all that kind of stuff. It was just very dirty, very unsafe in many places. And that is a ripe environment for what we would think of as demonic or negative psychic or spiritual activity. It can be no other way. That's why in India, in Chinese metaphysics, they place so much emphasis on cleanliness and the harmony of a place. Because like attracts like. Now, you have a variety of forces coming about. You have these metaphysical movements. You have these desires for authority and power and interest in the dark side of human nature, which should never be ignored, but never dwelled upon too much. So it would not be surprising that the geographical location becomes a perfect physical cauldron for a metaphysical stew that would possibly give rise to these forces of inversion. And not intentionally. It's not like they're sitting around a table. I mean, I know James Wasserman, and he passed last year. I mean, it's not like he would be sitting around the table with Son of Sam saying, hey, how can we figure out some way to murder people here? that wasn't his thing. That wasn't what he was into. But the craziness of the time, the drug abuse, the substance abuse was is not conducive to good decisions. And that just creates an aura, literally, quite literally an aura, an energetic component in a space, in a place, in a building, in a neighborhood. It ripples out, which becomes an attractive environment for psychic parasites, which then at some point someone's going to listen to the little whispers in their ear and, go out and do some pretty horrible things.
And how do you think that applies to, because even though New York was an exceptionally dark, violent place at that time, still, as we actually talked briefly in our phone conversation, there was also across the whole country, there was, that was in the 1970s eras when The Exorcist came out, and there just seemed to kind of be a general cultural turn towards what some would consider darker metaphysical ideas and darker topics. And I think the Necronomicon is probably a great example of that, because it's kind of based on the idea that we live in this kind of nihilistic, windswept universe where there's just all these evil, destructive forces out there. And if you want to survive, you need to align yourself with those forces. And so how do you think that the New York specific situation contributed or took away from the general national situation? And was that a general... was that purely, do you think, just a mental, psychological shift in the country, or was there some kind of driving force behind it, conscious or demonic or whatever?
I'll just say yes to that. Yes, it's all of the above. We try to put things in very narrow boxes, and they don't work. There's a variety of things that work when this happens, conscious and unconscious. You have to look. Again, we have the collapse of the counterculture movement, which had extremely high ideals. Extremely high. And the human potential movement, which that was a part of, which continues on into the 80s and into the 90s as part of the New Age movement, and we have it today. We can see that when those ideals collapse, as we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years in particular, that is those extremely high ideals of human potential, they collapse down into political authoritarianism, which is why we see most of the New Age movement and the what would have been the counterculture movement is essentially aligned itself and absorbed completely by what we would call progressive and very authoritarian political views, which is an irony. It's incredibly ironic. There's purges within the movement of people who aren't progressive or left enough, and that needs to be understood. So that when your ideals collapse, it's very easy to go to the other side. Because you have, I see on your floor, there's a dumbbell. You don't get strong by just lifting your arm. There has to be resistance. That resistance is what makes you strong. So when you have very, very high ideals, a part of you is also invoking the counter of those ideals so that you can overcome them within yourself. Now, that said, you look at the environment of the early 70s. The Exorcist was a peculiar book and movie. Of course, the author of it was from Scranton. He graduated University of Scranton, Jesuit boy. And it's such a strange phenomenon because it gripped the nation. And it gripped the nation in this idea that, of course, evil is present. And this is coming on the tails of, again, rioting in the country because of the civil rights movement and some of the problems that were happening at the time, the failure of the war in Vietnam and its collapse. So there is a certain national despair that is slowly seeping into the psyche. Again, these are in cycles. There's ups and downs. And this then has other impacts as well. And we see, again, the explosion of horror films. Now, we've always had horror films, but these are more and more present and more. The view is that the behind the surface of your neighborhood or middle-class existence is this terrible horror waiting to awaken. And there isn't much you can do about it. That's the other part. There isn't much you can do about it. Even the so-called forces of goodness aren't that strong against it.
Right.
You know, so this kind of nihilism is increasing across the psychological landscape, and that begins to turn. Of course, that doesn't have an effect on the elections too. You know, people were tired of it. They needed something optimistic and positive, and that's one of the major reasons that Reagan was elected. You know, it's morning in America. You know, wake up. We're going to have, and of course, the 80s with its wealth saw the explosion of the New Age movement. And then that continued into the 90s as well. As long as there was prosperity, there was continued, and there's the irony, expansion of what we would think of as new and emerging religious movements, which is simply another term for the counterculture movements. They just, you know, rebranded and reformed.
And so this general demoralization that happened, you think this is just part of a natural cycle of a society? Like, I guess the way I try to think of it is when we look back on these times, we can look back and see the period, see the time. What are the lessons to gain from it, though? Like how can we as individuals and as people learn from these things in a meaningful way to not just have this keep going over and over again?
Well, it's going to keep going over and over again. That's the nature of cycles. But we as individuals recognize that and don't get swamped by them. You don't get caught up in it. That's the nature of the egregore. The egregore sweeps you up. It sucks you up like a vacuum cleaner. And you think this time's going to be different. You know, we're better than those people. I mean, it's quite ironic how the counterculture movement has become so restrictive and authoritarian in its current form.
Right.
You know, it's just because, and they can't even recognize it because that's the unconscious part that they're in denial of. That's that dark force in their psyche, as the Jungian shadow, that they're just, oh, it's someone else. No, it's you. And I think when we look at,
presumably someday they'll snap out of it.
Well, they won't snap out of it. There's no snapping. You have to make an effort. It doesn't just happen. Okay. You know, the awaken, you know, and if anything does snap you out of it, it's incredibly traumatic. Yeah. It's
because like, you realize that your own mind got away from yourself. Or that you're really in control of yourself. That's correct. And that means some external force that has slapped you upside the head like a 2x4. And, you know, that's never pleasant. But, you know, when we look at a book like the Necronomicon, that falls right in that time frame. You know, the universe is a hostile place and God is absent. And that theme grows and dominates popular media and culture, really beginning to take on full frame in the late 90s and into the early 2000s in popular culture, popular media. And when we look at the Necronomicon, the thing that's interesting about it is it doesn't even matter whether it was a real translation or not, because it acts as if it were. And what we mean by that is the universe is not always as structured as people like to believe. And one of the occultists, the leaders of the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, one of the original ones, Brody Eanes said, you know, it doesn't matter if the unknown superiors, the invisible masters, the angels, or the Qlipothic demons, or any of these things exist, because the universe acts as if they do. And that's really an important part here, because when you create a book like that or publish a book, here we'll say create one, you have the potentiality of actually bringing it into existence on real metaphysical terms. So the question is, excuse me, you know, how responsible were Wasserman and Levenda, Simon and company in publishing this book? I have some serious questions about that. And I once asked James that, and he said, well, you know, they felt it was like any other grimoire, that, and it was up for people to make their decision about whether they would work with it or not. And that was after he wrote his autobiography, which is really a great book. It's a spectacular read about that time frame. In the Center of the Fire?
In the Center of the Fire.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah. And He's saying that anyone associated with this is getting injured. I mean, there's just these horrible paranormal phenomena occurring around the book. A lot of blood is getting let quite by accident. Break-ins are happening. All sorts of stuff, weird stuff is taking place. Okay, well, why do you want to be a part of that? And at that time, I think it was probably just the thing to do. It was hip. It was cool. They're probably not going to, well, we can't know from now anymore, but we'll probably never hear the real answer why it was published. The irony is, or maybe it's not an irony, the important part is that it has stayed in print ever since it was put into print. And as a fictional book, it has its roots in fiction, writing of H.P. Lovecraft, who, of course, saw the world as the universe as a cold and threatening place. So we see a lot of metaphysical notions being brought into the popular psyche and being reinforced over the last 20 years, which one always must ask, who benefits from this? The cui bono, who benefits?
Who benefits from a general malaise and a general demoralization and sense of nihilism?
Correct.
I actually have asked myself that question often. And also Simon, and for those who don't know, the Necronomicon was supposedly brought forth by a person named Simon, who is basically universally understood to be Peter Levenda, or universally suspected to be Peter Levenda. Levenda has denied it forever.
Has he denied it, or is he just never, he always seems to sidestep the question?
Yeah, I actually don't know exactly which would be the appropriate way to say that. I just know he has always managed to not say, yes, I was Simon.
Correct. That's my understanding from the interviews I've watched with him.
And that, because his aspect, and this is purely brain candy or just a thought experiment. Nobody knows for sure exactly what Levenda's motivations are. But we do know for sure that Levenda has very interesting ties with certain intelligence groups, etc. And at that time, he was in a weird circle of wandering bishops. And that's a very weird thing in itself, because a lot of the wandering bishops themselves were used by intelligence groups, basically as informants and spies. And then that kind of takes on it becomes like its own underworld. It's this underworld that involved these wandering bishops. But the thing that I'm trying to figure out while staying grounded and rational is, could theoretically the Necronomicon have been introduced with an intentional impulse to introduce this nihilism or this despair, or to just introduce generally these dark concepts to the popular American consciousness? Could that have been engineered intentionally? Do you think in general,
well, sure, certain
people have the foresight to initiate such things?
Well, sure, could have. And it doesn't necessarily mean foresight either. It just simply means a cruel sense of humor, too. I mean, let's not give people more credit than they deserve. And I think there's also an aspect, you talk about the wandering bishops, that needs to be put in perspective. Many of these wandering bishops received their ecclesiastical authority by way of old Roman Catholic Church lineages. And these bishops would often be connected to church lines that allowed them to travel a little more freely, usually in Africa, which was a considerable hot spot in terms of revolutionary and we'll say counter-revolutionary activities, whatever you want to call it, during the ending of the colonial era. And I think at one point, Cuba had 20,000 troops in Angola. It needs to be understood. It is coming on the tail end of a few years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And some of these bishops also had the capacity to go back and forth into Eastern Europe, which is behind the Iron Curtain. And we should not understate the profound cruelty of the prison state that was the Soviet Union and its allied countries. That cannot be overstated. This was a prison camp for a large percentage of the world's population. It was an evil place. And within that framework, some of these bishops were still able to be used for intelligence operations to get information, people on the ground. So it's a very complex web. You see the same today in many non-governmental organizations, international nonprofit organizations.
That's actually
they're essentially, many of them. I've often discouraged people from those, many of them, because many of them are really just intelligence operations.
That's funny that you mentioned that, because this whole Son of Sam thing, I mainly got into it because I stumbled upon the work of a guy named Manny Grossman, he's a New Yorker who's digging into the story again. He's finding a lot of the people that were involved, and he's actually churning up new information, which is both crazy and exciting. I mean, the guy is doing like new groundwork on something that happened, I don't know, like 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
But, I totally lost. And he has found a couple potential associations with nonprofit organizations, including like I think they're kind of like orphanage type things that they seem to have possibly been very shady organizations that were involved in dark things. And so, it pops up even there, the use of these nonprofit organizations as a way to do things under the radar.
Yeah, and one of the easiest ways is always the kids. I mean, when I was involved in nonprofit work, I mean, I called Catholic services, publicly out on the table at a small meeting of people, about what was going on, because people didn't want to understand it. There was an article in the paper, and they were making fun of the person who wrote it. Like, well, what do you mean they're bringing these people here? What do you mean? Like, what kind of conservative fool was writing this? And I turned to the guy from Catholic Social Services. I said, well, tell them. Well, you bring these folks in from New York and New Jersey and elsewhere. You actively go and recruit for relocation. And he hems and haws, and he admits to it. I mean, just last week we had 5 flight loads of children, no adults, come into our local airport, and the kids just have duct tape on them with their names written. So 2 of our local representatives were asking, what's going on here? Where are they coming from? Why is this happening? Who is paying for this? That's 500 children.
Wow.
So I think a lot of evil gets done in the name of the children, helping the children, because people don't want to say no to that. But a lot of evil gets done in the name of good. And I don't like to use the terms evil and good, but you think, you know what I mean? Mischief and terrible ideas are hidden. And that's the nature of an egregore. The egregore, on the political and religious level, or the metaphysical level, abuses your goodwill. It sells you an ideal that is so wonderful that how can you disagree with it? But you often don't get what you were promised. And so that's what I said, you need to understand, when it's not just that the counterculture movement collapsed around 75, but when it collapses, the despair and the disintegration and the misery and the sense of failure that comes with that is a powerful emotional force that's released. Think of any time you've done something in your life and you failed and how you felt. Now just multiply that.
Right.
Think of any time you've done something wonderful in your life and you've succeeded. Multiply that. This is kind of a way of beginning to get people to wrap their heads around how this release of energies is a fairly natural phenomena. Now, how we get around that is by understanding the nature of our own mind and not becoming overly upset by anything. Oh, it happened. Okay, it's terrible, but we move on. We find a way to move on. Oh, we are very successful. That's wonderful. It's great. We celebrate our successes, but we don't cling to it too much so that we think that it's going to be here forever, because it won't. Just as the bad times won't be here forever, neither will the good times. And now that doesn't mean we're cold and indifferent, But what we do is we learn to ride these circumstances. That's the nature of the spiritual path and the path to enlightenment. But that's also why it's so very few people are in it. And in that process, you have a lot of these groups, these occult groups and spiritual groups or whatever, call them what you want, that focus a great deal on personal power and authority rather than on personal awakening. And that's where you get into some real potential troubles, folks.
That's, I forget where I saw you mention this, but it's something that I've observed as well. There's been a lot of talk recently. A lot of people talk about this like great awakening type thing and how humanity is just about to realize all of the lies and everything. And you observed that if you go back to the 1960s, there were people saying basically the exact same thing. And there were a lot of people who got so caught up in those charismatic people, or just in general, in this idea that like we were about to enter this new era of absolute understanding and enlightenment. And those people wound up in not good places. And I've actually seen some YouTubers that I generally admire even now, who I think are getting caught up in these ideas and are pushing this idea that like, no, reality is going to be completely different. And I think they're pushing people to make some questionable and dangerous decisions for their lives. But anyway, yeah, I can see that happening right now. And you mentioned, well, I'll let you talk about it. Your perception, your perspective on it. Having been somebody who knows the 1960s history and how similar the 1960s were to now in this aspect of the Great Awakening and all of this.
Well, if we move into the 1980s, which is really the New Age movement, which is really when the counterculture goes mainstream. Okay. And by the 90s, it's full-blown mainstream. I mean, 90s was great. It really was. For this stuff. It was spectacularly fun.
The 90s, you said?
Yeah, the 90s. Yeah. Spectacularly fun. If we look at that, and we look at a lot of the things that were going on in the spiritual community, you saw the new and emerging religious movements, the counterculture spiritual community, we'll call it that, but it really wasn't counterculture. In fact, the early counterculture wasn't really counterculture. Most of those people were very well educated and came out of very, good families. What often isn't talked about is how many of them regretted what they wrote early on at the end of their lives. And that needs to be understood as well. And it's because the ideals were too high, or the effect on people's lives. It wasn't for everyone. It's like the story goes, not everybody can be an alchemist. Someone has to bake the bread. Okay. That's a part of life that isn't really grasped by many. So we look at the 80s and we see a lot of the ideas that are going on, and two go on within the movement. One is future utopianism. We're just going to hit this utopian place and everything's going to be great. And the other is apocalypticism. We're going to have some kind of cataclysmic events, whether it's going to be the new ice age, whether it's global warming, whether it's a meteor that's going to hit the earth, whether it's, some kind of, astrological event. And then from the ashes of that, like a phoenix, will arise the enlightened. Well, that was really not much different from what you were hearing from the evangelicals. Okay. The tendency was, and I'm surprised how many people are still reading those crappy books from the 80s, at least up until a few years ago. I really am. Because that gripped the psyche of people, and they poured a lot of energy into it. I'm sure some of your listeners remember the Gordon Michael Scallion and his Earth Changes map. I mean, Earth changes all the time. It's just crazy. I knew it made people nuts. Friends of mine were made crazy by it. Literally. And that's part of that mass psychosis formation on a smaller scale. That egregore on a smaller scale. What's fascinating, though, is if you look at the predictions made in the 80s and even the early 90s by the evangelical movements, the fundamentalists who are really apocalyptic, more of their predictions have come true in the last 8 to 8 years than the utopian visions of the New Age movement.
So
So what does that mean? And how do you deal with that?
Right, that's what I was going to ask.
You have to come to understand the situation you're in and take control of your own mind. And that means you have to become very comfortable with ambiguity and not necessarily distrusting authority. That's kind of a paranoia, but don't be foolish and trust it either. You have to have a strong wait and see approach. Wait and see. But that can really only, the more you know about history, the easier it is to see these cycles. That's one of the problems with astrological predictions. Now, I said on a show on New Year's Eve, I said, one of the problems with predictions is most people don't know history. So they always think that things are going to happen faster than they are. Now, right before you called, I was listening to a presentation by the French alchemist Jean Dubuis from 1999, in which he talked about the awakening that was going to happen. And he was never a believer that it was going to happen instantly and overnight, because, of course, he had experienced too much. I mean, he experienced the occupation of France in the 1940s, and he had a pretty sober notion of human potential, and in all directions. And someone asked him, what is going to be the greatest obstacle or resistance to awakening? Is it going to be religions or governments or companies or the general populace? And his answer was, it's what's going to be is laziness. Now, we look at the world today, and of course, we look at the obsession with self-medication.
Right.
And, as a former addictions counselor, people used to get upset with me when I'd say that you don't understand. For many people, marijuana is the gateway drug. We dual diagnosis or dual use was common, marijuana and alcohol. And most of them would say, well, I started with that, and that's when I went to hash, and then maybe to cocaine. And of course, this is a different time. The drugs of choice change over time. But when you legitimize substance use, you legitimize substance abuse through self-medication. And I'm not saying it should be illegal. Not. We know that there's tremendous health benefits to all of these things, particularly now with microdosing of LSD for dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and things of this nature. There's tremendous potential there. But that's the point. Where there's tremendous potential, there's also tremendous potential for abuse. And if we're looking at people's lives on a numerical scale, remember, when we think of conspiracy theory or that kind of thing, you're not looked at as an individual. You're just looked at as a number, part of a mass. It's throw enough against the wall and some of it will stick. If I can get one out of, well, just look what's going on with video games. Look at the amount of addiction that goes on every day, primarily with young men between the ages of 10, so they're children, and 30, 35. How many hours of life are wasted every day on video games? Same thing with, substance abuse. Okay, fine. You want to live your life in dreamland? You want to live your life in dreamland in front of a screen? You want to live your life in dreamland even doing various metaphysical practices, that's such as so-called spiritual practices? You're free to. But what that means is you take yourself out of the equation as being a force, as being an active entity in your own life and in the lives of others.
And so what does being an active entity look like?
Well, you're aware, you're conscious, you're making good decisions, you're making healthy decisions for yourself, and then from that for those around you, and you're engaged in your community on some level.
Okay.
You're not just sitting around complaining about the world and how things suck. You're out there trying to do something, even if that means fixing the neighborhood playground. And occultists are notorious whiners. They're notoriously infantile whiners.
We can agree on that for sure.
Yeah. And it's grow up time. See, this is the other part that people go to magic, people go to spirituality, people go to Vajrayana Buddhism or tantric yoga or whatever their drug of choice is, because they don't like themselves and they don't like their life, which is why you go to the Necronomicon. You go to the Necronomicon to get a magic spell, to get a demon to get you a new boyfriend, girlfriend, more money, a new car, what have you. You don't go to the Necronomicon for enlightenment. You go there for something to change the quality of your physical existence and your self concepts. Okay. And with that framework, you got to grow up. You've got to grow up and take responsibility for your life. And not just think, to try to get more stuff because you want more stuff. Even if you truly need it. I mean, you may really need a better house. You really need a better car, but you need to work on yourself first, your own understanding of yourself, your own understanding of your own mind. And what happens is all of these organizations and groups, they're going to give you the answer. And some of them can give you the tools for the answer, but they can't give you the answer. And when someone's going to offer you the answer, the capital T, capital A answer, it's usually going to be something that involves you becoming an extension of the group. You subsuming your existence to that movement. And that can happen even in different ways. Again, as I've said earlier, you can just be with a group of friends and, you're going to be like the 5 people you spend the most time with. So if you just spend your time with people who are playing video games or getting drunk or getting stoned or complaining about work or complaining about school or whatever, you're not going to get anywhere in life. You just get, what you're going to get is where you're going to get anyhow, and that's the grave. So people have to take the notion of the egregores, you have to take a really serious look at, who are the people you spend the most time with? And what is the influence of the people on you? And often very unconsciously. And that's the critical part, often very unconsciously. And then you have to make a conscious decision to separate yourself out.
It's like Tony Robbins used to advise becoming friends with people who are more successful than you. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. He obviously didn't use the idea of the egregore, but he advised that, become friends with people who are more successful or who are where you want to be. And simply being friends with them will help pull you in that direction.
I say that all the time. I mean, instead of joining, there are some successful esoteric groups out there, by the way, there are. But, many people would be better off that I've met. Getting a suit and a tie and joining their local Rotary Club, because they're going to get more magic done there of a material level where they could say, I participated in that, I made that happen, than they are, putting on their robes and doing their whatever they're doing.
And it says a lot that those organizations have kind of been disintegrating over the last couple of decades. Their membership is drying up. I mean, that's even the case with the Freemasons, to my understanding, that they just can't get people to join anymore.
Well, with Masonry, it's different, but Masonry is because it's a little different than, say, Rotary or Kiwanis, which tend to be more for business people. So they do have their different membership issues, but a lot of this notion too of when you look at the current generation, and that would be the last 15 years, 20 years, they tend to be the least involved and productive. Now, they may be very good at being advocates, but there's always the advocate for someone else to do something. It's not getting out there and doing something, which again is, join your local Kiwanis, join your local Rotary, join your local, maybe your Masonic Lodge if you want one or something of that nature. Join something and get involved in your community and even your library and its board of directors or volunteer. But you have to separate that out from your esotericism. That's something you do to be productive in your community. That's not your spiritual path. It can be an expression of it, but it's not it. And that needs to be understood. Your spiritual path is your inner awakening. And you can do that with others. You can help others if you have a good group that you're involved with. And we always encourage groups. I mean, the Institute's always encouraging local formation, because at the end of the day, esotericism is like politics. It's all local, which is what got this talking to begin with. What was that local environment in New York in the 70s? Well, it was a pretty crappy one. I mean, the occult communities in upstate New York were going to be pretty different. I mean, you saw the Borscht Belt, which was wealthy New York Jews who would vacation, in New York State and send their kids to summer camp there. Kind of like what, the movie, Dirty Dancing was a loose reference to, okay, gets transformed into the Buddha Belt. A lot of those summer camp, and some of them are beautiful. I've been to some of them, and they're just really spectacular throwbacks, to this time. And they gets transformed into the Buddha Belt as Tibetan Buddhist organizations primarily, but other groups are getting property on the cheap, or it's being donated to them, and they're setting up all these ashrams or these temples. So that transformation took place in that region. And that was a very different environment than what you would have found, downtown New York, or what you would have found maybe in, San Francisco, different areas of San Francisco. I mean, but just as that leads us to the other question, who is behind this? And I don't think you can point to one thing or one person. I mean, people had conspiracy on the mind because, of course, they weren't trusting the government. And we saw in the 70s with the church hearings, and you can go on YouTube and look this up, the realization that, MK Ultra was real.
That was also like the Iran-Contra affair was blown open by the church committee, I believe.
No, that was later, I think.
Oh,
that was
okay.
The church hearings were like in the early 70s, 72, 74, 75. And we're seeing that the CIA was involved in, various types of psychedelic and mind control experiments at Montreal University, which has been the home to quite a few paranormal conferences, by the way, and in San Francisco. And Candy Jones was probably one of the more interesting aspects of that. She was a New York radio host, fashion model, pinup girl from the Second World War. She had a modeling agency, and she traveled fairly widely. And, one night she tries to kill her psychiatrist husband. He then records what's going on, and, she's telling all these stories of brainwashing and these different effects, which a few years later we find out from the church hearings was true. So you have all of those activities going on. And I think a good documentary to watch on that would be Wormwood. And I think you can see that on Netflix.
Yeah, I have seen that. That's an excellent documentary.
Yeah. So all of that, then what happens now is people are looking for the answer. And there is no the answer. It's a variety of forces that come together at the right place and the right time and bring about some kind of chaos or destruction, or the right forces at the right time that bring about wonderful cultural revival, such as the Renaissance.
When we first started talking, you mentioned that this phenomenon is a kind of social control mechanism, and you likened it to Jacques Vallée's ideas about UFOs. Like roughly speaking, for those people who haven't heard of this concept, like Vallée, his idea is that, I hope I can encapsulate this briefly enough, is that it's like a room, like getting the temperature right in a room. Sometimes you turn it up and sometimes you turn it down. And that is the experience of the UFO phenomenon, that we have these flaps that come along at certain times to affect, I guess, human consciousness. And I believe, is that roughly a good way to conceptualize that idea?
Yeah, and the question is, what's really happening? He even states very clearly, we're never going to know what's happening. Okay. Because we don't have access to the information, all the data. And that's where we saw in the last year, again, people who don't have a sense of history were believing there was going to be some great revelation. I'm telling you, there's not going to be a great revelation. There's no reveal here. It's not going to happen. This is the same stuff that I can point to Life magazine or Look magazine from the 60s and have the same title, the same headline, similar content.
If it is embedded in the nature of reality in some way as some kind of consciousness control mechanism, what is the purpose of it then? Like why does this keep happening to keep misleading people in one direction or the other? Or do you have any ideas? I mean, you just said that we can't know for certain.
It's just why. I mean, why not? Look, not everybody is at the same level of conscientiousness, we'll say. I may have your best interests at heart, but it doesn't mean you have mine. And one of the problems is people who are kind of new to this notion of the path of awakening, who are kind of sensing that there's something more to life than material reality. They're still fundamentally materialists. They're still looking for physical craft to come down from space. They're still looking for physical paranormal phenomena to convince them of the reality of the spiritual dimensions. So they're still fundamentally materialists, and they're still slowly progressing away from that. Well, when you're that close to the ground, you're still much easier to pull back down, and you have to overcome your own inertia. Each of us does on our journey. We have to overcome our own ignorance, our own laziness, our own inertia, and that's just a setup. So the story goes in the Old Testament. There's two. People often think of evil or the devil in terms of a very Catholic view, a very fundamentalist view, in which it borders on an absolute dualism. There's God and the devil, and which is what you saw in all those movies, by the way, in the 70s and later on. God and the devil, God, and now there's not even God. Now there's just human beings on their own against the forces of evil, like in Supernatural, which is a funny show. I mean, I enjoyed it, and I thought the humorous episodes were the best, but for 15 years, I never thought it would go on that long. And what do you have? You have humanity in the face of a metaphysical evil in which angels are unreliable, and they're not much better than the demons, and God is a borderline absent dad psychopath. So, and when you see how many people are getting their metaphysical views from the media, that's an interesting point right there. But, if you look at the Old Testament, Satan is the adversary. He's the opposer. Someone says, God, I love you, you're the best. Satan says, you know what? I'm going to check that out. You tell me, I can bench press 500 pounds. Well, there's an easy way to check that out. And that's what the opposition does.
It's a test. It's
a test, and we bring it on ourselves. We bring it on ourselves through being here, through life, through incarnation. So, again, the metaphysical worldview that someone has decides not only it decides how they're going to, it decides in some ways the kind of phenomena they're going to experience, but more importantly, it decides how they're going to interpret the phenomena they do experience. And the metaphysical worldview that we've seen promoted actively in the media over the last 20 years is, like I've said, human beings in the face of this violent universe with the forces of, I don't like to say good, but forces that would be in their benefit appear to be absent or non-existent at all.
It's more of that demoralization. I mean, it just makes people feel isolated and alone, and as though there are forces of evil too big for them to counter, but there is no...
they have no champion.
Right, exactly.
And not only that, they have no champion that can teach them how to be their own champion. Now, within the increasing metaphysical view, say, of Vajrayana Buddhism, and as it spreads throughout the West, and more people get the Kala Chakra Tantra initiations, even though they usually don't understand what they're getting involved with, at least if they make an effort to try and understand that, they see that the notion is of the enlightened warrior, the enlightened being that becomes the champion, both of themselves and for others, against ignorance. And that ignorance can take some very violent and aggressive forms. Don't kid ourselves when we say ignorance. It's like, well, I don't know how to spell. It's more than that. It's very potentially dangerous and destructive forces. But you learn how to manage them because you've managed them within yourself. And you learn what right action is. What is enlightened action, which may not conform to conventional morality.
So do you mind if me asking, well, I guess it doesn't matter because I'm going to ask, but if you don't want to answer, are you initiated into that tantric body that you just mentioned?
Into the Kala Chakra?
Yeah, the Kala Chakra. No? Okay. And I'm just curious, why do you specifically call that out? You think that has some specific significance to the broader picture?
Well, because the Dalai Lama is famous for having done these mass initiations of tens of thousands of people in a single sitting. Central Park, I think, was one of them. I think the first initiation, I'd have to check, was 1981. In Milwaukee, or was it, I think, somewhere there? And then, of course, the big Central Park one was very famous. So you, even there within the popular culture, spiritual culture, I should say, you have that notion of raising an army. Literally, it's raising an army of bodhisattva warriors against the forces of darkness.
I'm hoping I'm not putting you in answer an uncomfortable question. How legitimate do you think that is?
How legitimate? It's as legitimate as any of them.
Yeah.
I mean, what is your metaphysical view? I mean, we see a lot of themes that we're coming back to over and over again in different groups and organizations. I think with people today, they look around, and particularly the last few years, and they recognize just how easy it is to bring everything to a stop. And they recognize that their life depends upon some very thin threads, which means they're prisoners. You're dependent on XYZ, which means you're not in control. You're a prisoner of the supply chain. Okay, so what does that mean? What is it that you can control? You got people telling you can't even go out. And if you go out, you got to wear a mask. And if you don't wear a mask, you're a bad person. Now, if you don't get your shots, you're a bad person. It's very heavily moralized. And I think that's an important part. Whether you do it or not is going to be a personal decision, but it's the moralization of it, how it's framed in terms of right and wrong, good and evil, righteousness and unrighteous, self and selfishness. It's very interesting to see the framework from a psychological perspective. It would be nice if they spend as much time telling people to, watch what they eat and exercise.
Right.
And lose weight. I mean that seriously.
No, I agree. I completely agree.
So with that said, you see many people getting a sense that, well, what's behind all this? And you're never going to get the answer because you're never going to know. You're always going to be wrong. Or should I say partially wrong? Because there's too many forces at play with people and things. What you have to learn to do is take faith in yourself, trust in yourself and your own awakening, your own ability to help yourself, help your family, help others, and become a force for responsibility. Become a force for personal awakening and personal responsibility. And that's going to be difficult because it means you're going to go against the crowd. You're going to go against the contemporary mass psychosis at times. Yeah. And you're going to go against that egregore. So choose your friends wisely. Choose where you live to the best of your ability wisely. Choose the media and the images and the ideas you consume and the songs you sing to yourself and the stories you tell yourself in your head right now. Choose them very carefully and wisely so that they're to your benefit, so that you're creating your life and your self-awareness rather than letting these other unconscious forces directly and indirectly influence you.
So regarding the timing of this psychic transformative event that we have gone through, like you just said, it has shifted the way people see things. I think everybody feels a little more vulnerable. Like, it's the prisoner of the supply chain is brilliant. I mean, that's it. Like, you realize that we're not at a point anymore where you can realistically just strike out with a gun and a shovel and make it okay. Like, we are at the prison of this net that we've created.
Mm-hmm.
The timing, though, overlapped with a time that a lot of astrologers were saying that, like, you know, and I'm actually not a big astrology guy, but I was struck by the fact that all of this did occur at a time when astrologers for a long time have been saying that this like 2020 period was going to be this huge transformative event. And it wasn't just, I think even Carl Jung pointed to this time, if I'm not mistaken. But I think he might have actually pinpointed the year. But regardless, there are people of various influences and various ideas who marked this time as this is going to be a transformative event. And it actually was. So do you think there is like legitimacy to this having been more than the simple material instances of what happened and actually being the marker of some kind of transformation that was part of the evolution of reality?
Evolution is the wrong word.
Okay.
People abuse that word. Evolution is simply adaptation to one's environment. Evolution is not a predetermined point. Individual organisms evolve, not collective ones. Okay, that's very important. So we have to stop using that word and stop using it wrongly.
Okay.
When we look at the circumstances, if we can predict it astrologically, that means it's a circumstantial event. It is a natural phenomenon. The circumstances will occur. What matters is the details, what will be involved in those circumstances. And then what matters is how will we respond to those circumstances? Will we simply react according to our predetermined predilections, our karmic tendencies or habits? Or will we become more alert, a little more responsive, a little more at ease, even though it's maybe dangerous and threatening, and take our time to assess and understand what's going on, or at least what's going on around and towards us? So there's no guaranteed awakening. There's no force that's going to drop down and awaken you. Because if it does, it's going to be terribly traumatic, by the way. I mean, think of Saul on the road to Damascus. Boom! He's out for 3 days.
Right.
Maybe more. So we have to keep that in mind. So just because we can predict it doesn't mean anything more than we can predict it. We can predict it was going to snow, but they got it wrong. I didn't get 3 inches of snow. I barely got 1. You know, am I going to even bother shoveling it? Probably not. But my neighbor was out there with a snowblower. I'm going to go make fun of him later. He just wants to make sure it works, but you know, I'm going to go make fun of him for it. But that's, you see the difference. We both have we both live in the same place, the same prediction. The prediction occurred partially. Yes, it was cold and we got snow, but we didn't get the amount we were predicted. And then how do we respond to it? That's what astrology is. It's really no different than the weather. It is the weather report is what it is. And it's up to us to make the best of it, whatever that means. And we can only make the best of it based upon our metaphysical or cosmological view. Now, the thing with conspiracies I want to point out is, you know, people have the conspiracies are real. They happen. History is full of them. Daily life is full of them. But if you're trying to find a single answer to pin everything on, even if you were to find it, how would you know it's true or recognize it? You wouldn't. You couldn't. Yeah. It's like the movie with James Coburn, Our Man Flint. It was a spoof on the James Bond films. I think it was made in the late 60s, early 70s, in which he's trying to find the great evil mastermind. And he finally gets to it, and it's the phone company. You know, you know, because at the time, the phone company was just, it was a terrible thing to try and deal with. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now we have multiple phone companies that can be terrible things to try and deal with. Yeah. So you have to recognize that. So what? So if you recognize that there are forces at work in the world of an invisible nature that you can't necessarily see, that may have a psychic component to them, how are you going to address your spiritual life so that you are no longer influenced by them, or at least not to the same degree as before?
And it also, I mean, it seems feasible to me that these groups, you say there are groups who have hidden agendas and hidden motives, mm-hmm. but they themselves presumably would be at the whim, at least occasionally, of forces greater than themselves.
Of course, so they have a life cycle too.
They don't even know what they're actually doing, is my point, I guess.
You're right. They have life cycles too. One only has to spend a great deal of time, not even a great deal of time, just a little bit of time studying the